So the Waterman Carene is an interesting fountain pen to me in terms of its design language. It's the only set nib fountain pen that I currently own, but it's not the only Waterman pen that I currently own. Now, when I first got into fountain pens, I started off with a Pilot Metropolitan, and then after I started using that, I was bitten by the bug and I started exploring other brands, sort of in that cheaper price point, and then gradually going up and up until I got into Mont Blanc territory a couple of years ago. Now, it wasn't until I found a Waterman Carene on Amazon for a decent price that I decided to actually get into the Carene model itself. I now own two Carenes and I'm going to showcase them in this video. So Waterman as a brand started back in the late 1800s, so they've been around for a while at this point. Now the Carene model itself appeared in the late 1990s, currently made in France. Based on Waterman's marketing material, the Carene is supposed to be based off, I guess, yachts. So it has that kind of nautical feel to it in terms of the design language that are on the pens themselves. So if we take a look at these two examples here, so we have the amber marine and we have a red one, which I'll talk about this one in a second. So you have the sort of wave-like spring-loaded clip on the cap. We have sort of a smooth, it's almost cigar-shaped, but then at the end of the pen here we have a kind of sloped section there on the rear. It's a snap cap, satisfying little click there. This isn't loose, it hasn't come off or anything like that at all. So you have the Waterman logo just at the top there, and then you have sort of the Waterman logo on the band here, and then it just says France on the other side over here. So 18 karat gold nib, it's a set nib. You have a simple plastic section coming down here, and then you have the set nib itself. And this one is cartridge converter, or you can have Waterman's proprietary cartridge as well. You do usually get one free cartridge in the box when you buy a Carene. I think Waterman stopped putting free converters in theirs a while ago, so if you've got an older one, you might have got a free converter. You might not get them going forward. So this particular model is basically the same design features. It has the Waterman stamp over here. It's got the Waterman on the cap, snap cap, plastic section coming down to the set nib. This one is rhodium, I believe, 18 carats. And again, I've got a cartridge in this particular one that came with the pen as opposed to a converter. One thing to note is that on the Watermans there's a little breather hole just over here, and then just above it you have something engraved which denotes the nib. This one says large or L, and the other one I've got is, I believe it's a fine from memory. Let me just check. Yeah, there's a little F just above the breather hole there. Now, one of the things to note about this particular pen is when you're writing with it, you write with the entire pen. Now, I know that seems a bit strange to say right off the get-go, but with most of the fountain pens, when you're writing with them, you're writing with just the nib and you're just holding it. Whereas with this, it really does feel like you're writing with the entire pen. It's a bit stiffer as a writing experience, and it's just a different feel to it than other pens that I've used in the past. Definitely not talking about like a flex nib or calligraphy nib or anything like that. It's just, it feels a bit different to other examples that I've seen in the past, just because of that design that it's got. There's a little bit of weight to these. They're not heavy by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just, you can sort of feel that they're a little bit more than, say, a totally plastic pen, a TWSBI, for example. They don't feel anything like that. There's just a little bit more weight to them. You can post them. I never post my pens, so that I don't particularly care about that at all in terms of whatever weight that would add, but it's negligible, to be perfectly honest. Now, the first pen here is in the amber finish. Now, this is the one I got off Amazon a while ago. I saw this going for a decent price, so I just decided, look, I may as well grab a Carene for cheap, just to try it out. The second pen that I've got here is actually something that I got just recently. I've only had this for about 2 weeks at this point. So the story behind this is there's a little pen shop in my area that I don't have too much occasion to go to, but when I am in that area, I always just stop by to see what they've got. And then when I swung by, I happened to notice they had this in the display case, and I've never seen a red one in this finish before, so I was like, oh, can I take a look at that? And I had a quick look at it. I was able to try it very briefly, just do a couple of quick lines with it, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to grab it, because I've never had this type of nib and this size. I'll do a writing sample in a second, and I've never seen this color before, so I decided to just jump on it and add that to my collection. So the Carene is a really interesting pen from a design standpoint. It's not super expensive like a Montblanc 149 or any of Montblanc's limited editions. It's not entry level either, but it's not, as I said, super expensive. Now, the pen has two problems which need to be called out. So the first is these little tines here of the set nib. What happens, ink will get caught under these. So when you're writing with it and you're holding the section, the tips of your finger will actually get a little bit of the ink from under the tines. Now, if you're in the fountain pen community, you have no problem with ink on your fingers. It happens all the times. It's just with this particular model, I found that does happen. Like, it's even happening right now in small amounts. So if you're doing any kind of writing, you will come away with inky fingers, just depending on how you hold it. With this one, I generally hold it a little bit more forward to the nib than I do with some other writing instruments that I own. Smooth writing experience is a little bit of scratch to the nib, not in a bad way at all. It just adds some texture to what you're writing with, and there's more of that ink that I mentioned earlier. So really enjoyable writing experience with this particular nib. But one of the problems that I've had with this, and I'll have to tell you a bit of a story with this one. With the Amber Carene, I've owned this for a couple of years at this point, and I do have a story about this particular one. So I'm someone who likes to take my pens out into the real world and actually use them, as opposed to just keeping them at home. So there was this one time where I took my Carene into the office for the first time. It was in a little folder with my notepad, and it was in a backpack. So I went to the office. It was a normal commute. I wasn't doing any parkour. I wasn't fighting any ninjas on the streets, just a normal commute in. So when we were in the office, there I was. We were having a meeting. It was an internal one. So I had my pen out. I had my notepad. We're just about to start the meeting, and then one of my colleagues says, "Is that blood?" And we all sort of like, wait, what? What's going on? So we all look around, and then there's this little pool of red on the table. Now, it turned out that I'd actually put a rich red ink into my Carene the day before. So what we were looking at was actually a leak and not a murder scene. It turned out that on my rather boring commute, when my pen had been sitting upright in my bag the entire time, somehow what had happened is ink had leaked. It had been disturbed enough that ink had leaked out of the breathe hole here into the cap. And when I uncapped to start writing, the ink had splashed out on the table and I hadn't really seen it. So there was this pool of red and I just hadn't noticed it. Now we went ahead, we just grabbed some wet wipes and we cleaned up the spill and we were back underway with the meeting. But the fact that a work meeting was disrupted means that I just can't trust the Carene in daily life anymore. It was an internal meeting with colleagues who were willing to put up with my eccentricities. None of them are fountain pen enthusiasts, so I could afford a bit of disruption with them. But if I'd been out to a client meeting or discussing with someone external, that kind of incident would have completely derailed the conversation in the worst way possible, and it's just not acceptable in that kind of context. For that reason, while the Carene's really interesting from a design standpoint, and it's interesting to write with, I personally cannot trust it out in the real world ever again. Since that incident, I've never taken these pens outside since then. They just sit at home these days. Now, moving across to my newer acquisition, the red Carene. As I said, I've only owned this for about 2 weeks at this point. I think it's rhodium. I don't even know if that's the right way to spell that. Now, the thing with this nib is there's a bit of a sweet spot to it. Oop. And you can see the problem already. The way this works is there's basically two sweet spots to the nib, and if you don't hit them dead on, then you find that you just don't get the same writing. Also, the nib is a little bit more squeaky and it's not quite as comfortable and crunchy as the amber one is. I don't know if that's just this particular nib size or it's this particular unit. I have a hunch this was probably older and it's probably secondhand. It was sold as new, but we'll see. The nib size and the line that we get out of this particular one is interesting enough to me that I'm sort of willing to put up with the finicky nature of this nib for now. That may change over time. But as I said, it's finicky. There's two sweet spots and you either hit them dead on or your lines basically fret out, is what I describe it as, but there's no frets involved here. So it just chokes out. Because it's relatively new, I'm willing to give it a bit more time to see if I can get used to it and see if I can learn how to better hit those two sweet spots that I mentioned. I may change my mind with this over time and just either get it tuned or get rid of it, just move it on to someone else. But we'll sort of have to wait and see. It's only been like a week and a half at this point since I've had it, and I am enjoying the lines from this and the writing experience enough to give it more time. But it's just not as comfortable as the fine nib Carene that I have over, that I just showed a moment ago. Now, overall with the Carene, it's a really interesting design and it's an interesting pen to use. It's got some history. It's from a reputable brand. For me personally, I just can't trust these out in the real world ever since that incident, that little story I mentioned earlier. So while these might have been fun to take out, I just cannot trust them anymore. If you're interested in the model and you can find them at a good price, I'd say grab one for your collection, but I'd sort of just warn you guys that perhaps this isn't really an everyday writer that you could take out with you, depending on where you go. As I said, I've never trusted them again in the real world ever since that incident. These days, I'll generally take a 149 out or something, depending on where I am and what I'm doing, but these ones very much stay at home these days, and I just don't have the trust in them anymore to bring them out. So while it's an interesting pen, it's got some good features and it has some interesting design language, I would recommend maybe grab one for your collection. I counsel you against having one as a daily writer out in the real world. Most of us work from home quite often in this day and age, so it's not as much of a problem as it used to be. But on the days I do go into the office, I don't travel with this anymore. That has been my thoughts on the Waterman Carene. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.